My name is Jocelyn Rosnick, and I'm Policy Director for the ACLU of Ohio. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And again, I just want to thank you for sharing your evening with us for our exciting program, Your Taxes, Their Decisions, the Policy and Politics of Ohio's Budget Process. Here with me tonight to discuss our budget process and specific issues to look out for are my policy team members. We have Colin Marazzi, Deputy Policy Director, Gary Daniels, our chief lobbyist, Patrick Higgins, policy counsel, Sean McCann, policy strategist, and Pat Gladura, policy strategist. So again, a little bit of housekeeping. It does seem like we are able to put information in the chat for you. So we will be doing that throughout tonight's program. We'll have links to different resources. Some of them are ACLU of Ohio resources. Some are from our friends at different partner organizations like Policy Matters Ohio. We'll also drop in ways for you to get engaged with us on various issues and the budget itself. So to ask questions of the panelists, please use the Q&A function. I guess that's easy because the chat isn't working for us tonight. So if you have any burning questions for the panel, please put them in the Q&A, and I will be squirreling those away throughout the program so we can try to get to as many questions as possible. So for now, let's dive in. We're going to start up at 30,000 feet. And for that, I would love to start with Gary. Can you talk a little bit about the different budgets that we have as a state? What are they? When do they occur? How do the different departmental agencies, the governor's office, and the legislature end up working together?
Thanks, Jocelyn, and thank you for everybody for tuning in. We realize this isn't the most, perhaps compelling topic of the budget and everything, but we think it's important nonetheless to understand how the state operates and how it gets funded. And so Ohio actually has 5 different budgets, not just the one. Not all of them are central to the types of issues I think that we all care about, those of you on the call tuned in and those of us presenting here, but they are rather easy to understand. The first 2 are intertwined. One is a Bureau of Workers' Compensation budget. That, of course, helps with worker safety and paying out to people who have been injured or become sick on the job. That is a budget. All of these budgets, I should say, are for 2-year periods. If you don't know, Ohio is on a 2-year legislative session. So when we're talking about budgets, we're talking about funding every 2 years for these particular matters. So yeah, Bureau of Workers' Comp, the money it gets, it doesn't come from taxpayers. It doesn't come from the federal government or anything. It comes from money assessed to employers that then funds the Bureau of Workers' Comp. And to give you an idea of the amount of money in there, the most recent Bureau of Workers' Comp budget was about $755 million. Very much related to the Bureau of Workers' Comp budget is a technically separate budget, the Industrial Commission budget. Ever heard of the Industrial Commission? Probably not. Very few of us have. In the Industrial Commission, what they do is they adjudicate or decide or essentially handle worker disputes when it comes to the Bureau of Workers' Compensation. So people aren't always in agreement that workers should be receiving Bureau of Workers' Compensation, and so this is the entity that decides and works on this, sort of like a quasi court, if you will, but not quite, perhaps the wrong way to put it. But they are funded through employer assessments as well, just like the Bureau of Workers' Compensation, and just like the Bureau of Workers' Compensation budget. It's an every 2-year budget during the odd years. So right now, February 2025, we're talking about them working on or soon to be working on both the Bureau of Workers' Compensation and the Industrial Commission budget. That's all you need to know about those budgets for these purposes, but it's just to let you know that we technically have 5, and we're now 40% of the way through those budgets. The third, again, not entirely relevant to the types of issues that we are here today discussing, but the transportation budget. What does the transportation budget do? Well, it does exactly what it sounds like it does. It funds the bridges, it funds the highways, it funds the construction of those, the maintenance of those, public safety initiatives. It's a conduit for federal money for some of these projects. The federal government sometimes pays for these in part or in their entirety. Like, for instance, if a bridge is being built or maintained or renovated. It's an odd year budget. So here in 2025, we're talking about that we will have a transportation budget. And in fact, right now, do have a bill that represents the transportation budget that the legislature is working on. And to give you an idea of the types of finances involved with that, we're talking about $13.5 billion. That was for the most recent one 2 years ago with regard to the transportation budget. Now we're getting into a little bit more of the nitty gritty. We're now 60% of the way through the 5 budgets. And the fourth one I will mention is let's do the main budget. People refer to it as the main budget. They refer to it as the general budget. They refer to it as the general operating budget. This is the huge budget. This is the one when people talk about budget season at the State House, or DeWine just signed the budget bill. This is the budget that they are talking about. Like the other 3, this is handled during the odd years. Ohio's fiscal year starts July 1st, so they get this done before July 1st. This is made up of all of the revenue that the state usually gets, from taxes and things of that nature. It funds government. It funds the state. We're talking about all the state agencies. We're talking about the prisons. We're talking about schools. We're talking about the judiciary. We're talking about the legislature, the Secretary of State's office, the Department of Public Safety, everything that you can think of within the agencies, the departments, what have you. That comes under the rubric of the main operating budget. The budget projected for this particular budget cycle that we're in right now, $61 billion is what Governor DeWine is proposing. And one of the things that you should know about this isn't just a money budget. Over time, as the legislature discusses and debates this budget, policies will start to be added to this budget. And that's very important for the purposes of all of us here today, because they like to sneak things in to the big main budget bill, sometimes things that are controversial, because it's very hard, if it's a standalone bill devoted to a particular topic and it goes through the normal legislative process of hearings and testimony and what have you, it's easier to oppose. Jam it into hundreds and hundreds of page giant budget bill and tuck it away, it becomes much more difficult to address at that point. So as time goes on during this budget season, we will see these policies added to it. Now, you might be a A+ student of Ohio government and say, hey, wait a second, doesn't Ohio have what's known as a single subject rule that says that any legislation must only have a single subject? Well, they sort of get away with this, at least as far as the courts are concerned, by all framing it as a budget issue. As long as there's some sort of nexus to the general budget of the state, that's how they do it. Now, I will say that doesn't always happen. There's plenty in there that, we would all argue doesn't have a relationship with the budget, but nonetheless, they do it anyway, and it's something very important to look out for. And then the final one, now that we're 80% of the way through the budgets, the final one, those other 4, as I mentioned, those are handled during odd numbered years. This final one is handled during even number years, and that is what we call the capital budget or the capital appropriations budget. This one is all about money, and it's all about pork. If you're unfamiliar with the term pork, that's the money that legislators essentially bring home to the home districts and fund projects there. So you're talking about parks and community centers and buildings that need knocked down and buildings that need built, and a whole bunch of other things in that capital budget. So that main budget I mentioned this year, $61 billion, this capital appropriations budget the last time around, that was $4.2 billion. So lot of attention paid to the capital budget, but not nearly as much, understandably, as is paid to the main operating or general budget. So that's the 5 budgets that we have here in Ohio. But for you, the noisy person out there that wants to be even more active than you already are, paying attention to these issues, that main or general operating budget, that's the one you really want to pay attention to, both for the money that's spent and also for the policies that later become law in there. So that, in a nutshell, is the 5 budgets and what to know about them here in Ohio.
Thank you so much, Gary, for breaking it down for us. It's certainly a lot to dig into, and the budget is really a big deal when we're talking about dollars in the billions and the tens of billions. So we're starting with Gary up at 30,000 feet, and throughout the program tonight, we're going to get into the weeds, but now we're going to take it down to about 10,000 feet. And I'm hoping, Sean, you can help us dig in just a little bit deeper. Where are we in the current process? Can you talk a little bit about the process and the next steps?
Yeah, thanks, Jocelyn, and thanks, Gary, for kicking us off with, like Gary said, what is surely the most exciting topic you could be hearing about on your Thursday night. But very important nonetheless, $61 billion worth of importance. So yeah, I'll do my best, of course, with it's such a dense topic, but taking us back down to the 10,000 foot level. So Gary kind of gave you the basics, right, of what the state operating budget funds, kind of the broad strokes of it. And where we are right now is that Governor DeWine, who is, of course, in his final term as governor, he earlier this month proposed his executive budget. He rolls it out with a press conference. There's a document known as the Blue Book that summarizes is not really the right way to put it because it's a few hundred pages long, but that lays out the entirety of his proposal. Everything from, those agencies that Gary rattled off, the Department of Education and Workforce, the Department of Medicaid, Department of Public Safety, all the way down to smaller agencies like the Ohio Arts Council or the, Ohio Air Quality Development Authority. I think that exists. I'm 99% sure about that. So the governor's rolled out his budget, right? That was a few weeks ago. And all budgets begin in the Ohio House. The Ohio House is the originating chamber. It's kind of the phrase for the budget. So the House has now been conducting hearings through the House Finance Committee and through several other standing committees that are divided up by subject area. They've been conducting those hearings for the last few weeks. So, the Finance Committee kind of kicks us off by hearing from the largest agencies, your Medicaids, your education and workforces of the world, the Department of Rehabilitation and Correction, that runs the state prison system. And they also hear economic projections from the Ohio Office of Budget and Management, which is kind of like really the clearinghouse for a lot of these resources too about the state budget. The OBM director is kind of the one who talks about the governor's vision for the budget, what they're expecting for the next couple of years in terms of the economic forecast, to the extent that you're able to kind of say what things will look like. And then another agency known as the Legislative Service Commission. They're a nonpartisan agency that actually drafts all the legislation that you see get introduced and that goes through the legislative process. They also do research, for example, on like economic forecasting or research at the request of members. Their director comes in to give a different, largely the economic projections line up to a degree, but they give another take on the economic projections that the state is expecting for the next couple of years. So those big hearings have already happened, and now, like I said, the Finance Committee and the other standing committees have been conducting hearings on the budget for a few weeks now, and it's also been introduced in bill form. Which, if you thought the Blue Book was long, the budget HB 96 is several thousand pages. I'm sorry, HB 72. Nope, HB 96. I was right the first time. HB 72 is a different bill that we're watching. And my brain just mixed them up. Several thousand pages long, covering all these different subject areas. So it's a lot for all these committees to get through. And as members are, as committees are conducting hearings, as members are asking questions, the Finance Committee is preparing changes to the bill that are introduced in what's called a substitute bill. That term just basically means it's a bill that's replacing the original version of the bill. There are so many changes that are being drafted that the bill kind of becomes a new version. So the committee will consider those changes and then adopt the substitute bill as sort of the working document, and then continue hearings to look at, okay, what changes did we make? What still needs to be looked at? And that's kind of where, like Gary said, some of these policy changes that aren't necessarily related to the budget come in, where members decide they have a pet issue that they'd like to sneak in, that maybe the governor didn't touch, but they'd like to get it addressed through the budget. So that's, we always have our eyes open, ears to the ground for policy changes as the budget makes its way through and the substitute version gets introduced. And as members are conducting these additional hearings, there's one more round of changes after the substitute bill that's known as the omnibus amendment. Just, another kind of, not free for all, but like another round of changes that reflect what members want to see before the Finance Committee is ready to vote on the bill and then send it to the House floor. And once the bill's on the House floor, at that point, the Speaker of the House knows that it has the votes to pass, and members will give speeches, addressing different things they'd like to talk about, why they support the budget, why they maybe don't, things they would like the Senate to do, and then obviously the Senate has a role to play here. Once the budget passes the House, it goes over to the Senate, and the same process takes place with the Senate's Finance Committee, with other standing committees divided up by each of those subject areas. So, long story short, we've got the House committee process, the Senate committee process. The Senate gets a chance, to vote the bill out of its Finance Committee, vote on the floor, and then I'll be really quick, but this is a little bit in the weeds. What happens then? Almost always, when a budget has reached the point where it's gone through the House and gone through the Senate, and the Senate has made additional changes, as they always do, the bill then returns to the House, and the House has to decide, basically, do we concur with the changes that the Senate has made, or do we reject those changes? This is kind of the official terminology, but really what they're doing is saying, like, okay, like, we see what you did, but also we would like to hammer out some of these changes, see what we can compromise on. So in all likelihood, once the bill comes back from the Senate with these changes that the Senate made, the House is going to say, we reject concurrence with the Senate amendments, which triggers what's called the conference committee. That has 3 members from each chamber, 2 of the majority party, 1 of the minority party. So in this case, with our current legislature, you'd have 4 Republicans, 2 from the House, 2 from the Senate, and then 2 Democrats, 1 from the House, 1 from the Senate, getting together, hunkering down behind closed doors to kind of hammer out what version of the bill they like for each and every agency, commission, et cetera, but that they're going to have to decide between the House version of the bill as it regards, the Medicaid department, or the Senate version of the bill. They can even go back to the version that the governor proposed. So, you go down line by line by line of these thousands of lines of the bill. And once the conference committee has decided, yep, we'd like to place the bills in, then both chambers vote on approving the conference report, which is just another way of saying, like, that both chambers vote on the version of the bill that has been compromised on by those members that were selected to serve on the conference committee. So a lot of weeds there, a lot of kind of, complicated terminology, but basically, the House gets a crack, Senate gets a crack, and then they come together to compromise on the version they'd like to see returned to the governor's desk for his signature. And the last thing to mention there, the governor has 10 days to sign the bill, but he can also use what's called the line item veto to say, I don't actually like what they did with this aspect of the Department of Education's budget, so I'm going to single out that provision and veto it. Long story short, the governor, after deciding what he wants to line item veto, puts his signature on the bill by June 30th, and boom, we have the state operating budget. Pretty simple, right? Nothing too crazy.
Thank you so much, Sean. Someone just put in the Q&A chat that this must take years. How can you talk about when the process starts. So just to summarize and recap for folks again, the administrative agencies, the departments, like Sean was saying, the Department of Youth Services, Department of Rehabilitation Corrections, the Department of Health, all the different agencies that are going to have appropriations in the budget, come up with their wish list. That goes to the governor's office, and OBM, and then the first budget that comes out is that budget, governor's budget. Then it goes to the House, then it goes to the Senate, then it goes to the conference committee. And yes, the process is long. Just want to call out that in the webinar chat, our colleagues from the communications team did drop in our process 101. So if you didn't catch every little detail, it's okay. It is in the cheat sheet that we created for you. But yeah, the process doesn't take years, but it feels like it. So Sean, can you respond on how long from start to finish it typically takes, and any other just tidbits, cheat codes for the gamers here with us tonight that people should know when it comes to the budget?
Yeah, so it's a great question about how long it takes. And like I said, so the governor introduced, the governor proposed his version of the budget earlier this month. We're looking at about 6 months between, when the governor has proposed his budget and when it must be passed, which actually that June 30th deadline that I mentioned, that is required by the Constitution, that the state has a budget that is passed. And I'm sorry, I said 6 months, but 5 months would be the answer. But the Constitution requires that the budget be signed into law by 11:59 p.m. on June 30th. So yeah, and like Jocelyn said, that the process of agencies developing their budgets, that does, that extends a few months before the first of the year. So state agencies like Department of Youth Services, like Rehabilitation and Correction, are working on their budget proposals in the fall prior to the year that the budget is passed. So those agencies were working on things back in September. But as far as the legislature is concerned, it's a really tight 5-month window. And the Senate might get the budget bill from the House in mid to late April. So both chambers are really on the clock. And the agencies are too. They've got to wrap up their proposals by the end of, in this case, but they had to wrap them up by the end of 2024 and get them to the governor, so the governor could tell the legislature, hey, here's what you're working with by early February.
Thank you so much, Sean. There is certainly a lot to dig into. The budget process can be intimidating, but we are trying to break it down for you. Please check out the cheat sheet and know that we and other social justice partners are engaged in the process, and there are easy ways for you all to plug in. So we're going to start to get a little bit more into the policy and politics part of tonight's discussion, and a little less process. So thanks for hanging on, but got to start with the process so we know how we got to where we are today and where we're headed. As Gary mentioned up at the top, sometimes policy slips into the budget. It's not just dollars and appropriations as one might think. And we wanted to share an example of a budget process that we thought really highlighted that. And I, sat there and was thinking, I think 2021 from recent history is the best example. So this is the process that took place in 2021 for the 2022-2023 budget. And I just have 3 examples of policy provisions that were put in that budget. Trust me, there are a lot more, but I just picked 3 quick examples to share. And the first up is abortion restrictions. So Ohio lawmakers actually added the requirement for doctors who partner with ambulatory surgical facilities that provide abortions to practice no less than 25 miles from that contracted facility. So basically, if you are an abortion care provider, you have to have a contract with an ambulatory surgical facility, basically just a place that is held to a very high healthcare standard that has a lot more restrictions, a lot more requirements. You have to be practicing within 25 miles from that facility. So it made it a lot harder when you look at the map of the state of Ohio to find the different places in different regions where folks actually could practice. And that was something that had come up in different pieces of legislation, but ultimately it ended up in a budget. That's what happened. The second example is disability advocacy. So Disability Rights Ohio provides advocacy, assistance, education, research, investigations, and even at times legal representation for people with disabilities across Ohio. They do not receive any Ohio state funding. They simply act as Ohio's independent recipient of federal funding for this type of work. And yet, Ohio lawmakers during the budget process in 2021 created an oversight mechanism for this nonprofit organization. And we and many others argued against that during the budget process because we believed it would threaten their independence and ultimately make them less efficient. And the third example that I have chosen to share tonight is related to healthcare discrimination. So if you recall the phrase medical conscience clause, that is from the 2021 budget process. Many of us would argue this was the most radical language added to the budget at the time. And essentially, it would allow healthcare providers and insurers to discriminate against people for moral or ethical reasons. So essentially, they could refuse to provide services if it violated their conscience. And that's why it was dubbed the Conscience Clause. This provision was buried within 695 pages of an omnibus amendment to the budget bill. It was introduced after House committee hearings already had ended and the day before the Senate passed it without debate. So there was basically no public opportunity to engage or discuss this issue. It was tucked into this very, very large amendment and basically, passed in the middle of the night. Many of us warned that there could be far-reaching practical implications, and unfortunately, this provision is still in ongoing litigation. So again, these are just a couple of examples that have been cherry-picked from just one budget season. There are a lot more examples out there over the years. And it's always good to reflect on the past as we start to move into and look at the present and the future. And I would like to have Colin join me to talk to us a little bit about what we're hearing from Ohio's leadership this time around. What are the priorities? What should people be watching for?
Yeah, thanks, Jocelyn, and thank you all so much for joining us tonight. The recurring theme that we're hearing from both the governor and legislative leadership is that this is a budget that's going to get back to normal. Recent operating budgets have really enjoyed an increased level of funding for COVID response, and the state's been shelling out dollars in record fashion. Now, those COVID dollars have dried up. So we're thinking and we're hearing that agencies were told to plan for some belt tightening this time around. And before I even get to the provisions in the budget and the priorities, I think we need to address the elephant in the room, which is the recent move by the Trump administration to pause all federal grant and loan payments. Confusion persists over the extent and the duration of that funding freeze. And should it persist, the General Assembly and the governor are going to have their hands full filling that budget gap. Just as a point of reference, federal funding accounts for 26% of Ohio's operating budget. $1 in $4 spent by the state of Ohio during our operating budget is federally sourced. So certainly something to keep an eye on as we work through this process. Now, for tonight's purposes, we'll go ahead and just move forward like that federal funding remains. And when we're talking about what's included in the budget, I would actually start with what's not in the budget right now, which is a tax cut. Typically, this goes against the grain in Ohio. Normally, we see tax rate cuts, consolidation of tax brackets, or both. And nothing like that is in the governor's proposal. Now, we know a lot of members of the General Assembly are very interested in creating a flat tax or eliminating the income tax altogether. Governor DeWine seems adamant. Now is not the time for further cutting of Ohio's tax base, but we'll see how that shakes out. The General Assembly could go along with the governor, or they could move forward and pass a tax cut regardless and challenge Governor DeWine to either go along with them or potentially veto a tax cut, which we know politicians are so against all the time. So we'll definitely be keeping an eye on that. Also, when we're talking about state budgets, K through 12 education funding always plays a leading discussion, and this year will be no different. We're seeing actually already some separation between Governor DeWine and House Speaker Matt Huffman on the planned final phase-in of the Fair School Funding model, which was a bipartisan piece of legislation passed a number of years ago with the intent and with the purpose of right-sizing our per-pupil state spending on K through 12 education. We all know the DeRolf decision back in 1997, where the Ohio Supreme Court ruled that Ohio's funding model for their public schools was unconstitutional because it relied too heavily on property taxes. The Fair School Funding Plan was an honest, good faith attempt to right that ship. And so the governor is actually, proposing to fully fund phase 3. However, on the other hand, we see House Speaker Matt Huffman really saying that that's not an option, calling phase 3 of the Fair School Funding model unsustainable, and saying that he is under no obligation to follow the spending decisions of previous General Assemblies. So we are already seeing some heads starting to butt on that front. In addition, we already know that Speaker Huffman is a champion of expanding access to private school vouchers. And I'll be surprised if we don't see a further expansion of school choice options and awards in this budget. That's going to be a hot topic of debate because this past year, following the most recent round of school choice expansion and voucher expansion, we actually saw that line item in the state budget balloon up to almost $1 billion. And those are dollars that are coming directly out of our public school system. So I think it's fair to say there's going to be some heated discussions in the K through 12 funding realm this spring and summer. So now returning to the tax discussion, I know this has gotten a lot of interest in a lot of papers, especially up in Northeast Ohio, and I'll get to that in a moment. But when we're talking about taxes, the governor actually went the opposite way. He didn't propose any tax cuts, and he actually proposed some tax increases on certain items and activities. Namely, he proposed doubling from 20% to 40% the sports gaming tax in the state of Ohio. He wants to use that additional revenue to establish a fund to help support professional sports team stadium construction. Now, we all have seen and heard the Browns' plans to move to Brook Park in suburban Cleveland, and there have been repeated asks by Browns ownership of both the city of Cleveland and the state of Ohio for taxpayer support to help fund the construction of this new stadium. This move by the governor would propose to create a permanent funding stream for supporting those professional sports stadium construction projects. In addition, the governor is also proposing a doubling of the state cigarette tax, an additional $1.50 per pack tax that would be used to help fund a redeemable $1,000 child tax credit for every child in the state up to 6 years old. So a rather innovative approach for creating a child tax credit. We have already seen several members of both parties in the General Assembly kind of scratch their head at the administration's decision to base potential, support for young families and children on sin taxes and what kind of incentives that creates. I think that we are going to be continuing to hear more about those proposals, especially when we start talking about Browns and professional sports and public taxpayer dollars. A lot of tensions can often come to a head, so we'll be watching that very closely. Finally, I want to mention energy and energy generation in the state. House Speaker Matt Huffman and Senate President Rob McCauley have really been in lockstep thus far on calling for significant investments to bolster Ohio's energy production. And that's a direct result of the growing electrical demand of these massive development projects, particularly by tech companies in the central Ohio region, thinking about the Intel plant expansion, the Anduril plant here down in Columbus as well. These projects require a significant amount of energy, and it is really becoming a burden on our energy grid. It's widely accepted that Ohio's energy demand will outpace our generation capabilities by 2030. And this has spurred groups like the Ohio Business Roundtable, the Ohio Chamber of Commerce, movers and shakers in Columbus to push for significant changes to our energy laws, all with the intent of incentivizing new development. And in some instances, we're actually hearing for allowing what's called self-generating or mini plant development, which is what they are proposing for these large energy consuming entities to actually be able to have their own dedicated power plants, not tied in to the rest of our electrical grid, whose sole purpose would be to power those very large energy consumption entities. So a lot to follow there. It's going to be really interesting to see how the General Assembly operates in this space, obviously, with the shadow of the House Bill 6 scandal still over everybody's head. So that's another interesting aspect to watch. Now, before I close, I'll just say, as Sean said, the operating budget is really in its infancy. There's a long way to go before the bill ends up on the governor's desk. Many things can change, many things will change. But I think it's safe to say these topics are really going to be driving the conversation through the end of June.
Thank you so much, Colin, for giving us kind of the sneak peek as to the proposed priorities of leadership and some of the fights that we might see in the House and the Senate over the next couple of months. So again, education, energy, and taxes. And I won't say anything about the Browns, but I do live up here in Cleveland. So we're going to shift now to a little bit of an ACLU of Ohio priority forecast, talk about a couple of issues that are ones that we're really digging in deep and paying a lot of close attention to. The sneak peek of those two topics is youth justice and cannabis policy. So if you have any burning questions on youth justice or cannabis policy, please put them in the Q&A function, because we'll be wrapping up our program in about 10 minutes or so. But Pat, let's start with the issue of youth justice. We know that Governor DeWine's working group on juvenile justice issued, I believe, 26 recommendations last year, one of which was smaller is better when it comes to the size of youth prisons and detention facilities here in Ohio. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about that, about the governor's working group recommendations and how that might relate to the budget.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jocelyn. And again, as others have said, thank you all for joining tonight. My name is Pat Glidura. I am a policy strategist in the Cleveland office, and I work on our youth justice policy. And so to start, let's start with that smaller is better concept. So Governor Mike DeWine put together that juvenile justice working group last year, and they put together 26 recommendations, as Jocelyn said, with the largest of which being the smaller is better facility recommendation. So currently, the Department of Youth Services runs 3 large youth detention facilities and 11 community correctional facilities. This smaller is better concept would move DYS away from those large facilities to smaller, closer to home or closer to communities facilities that are more suited to serve the youth in the state. So these would be smaller facilities with less beds, but higher rates of staff and mental health professionals, as well as buy-in from community partners around each of these facilities to help rehabilitate the youth in those communities. So when we're looking at the budgets, we're looking to see a commitment to this smaller is better structure. And so we actually have to take it back to last year's capital budget to get to see the appropriations for the facility construction. In last year's capital budget, around $33 million were allocated for the construction of more community rehabilitation centers. So those are the centers where youth are diverted out of the large facilities and are treated in these more intensive environments that are meant to rehabilitate them closer to home. And then $130 million was allocated to build these new smaller facilities. And so we're actually already going to see groundbreaking for those facilities in Cuyahoga County this year with the closure of the Cuyahoga Hills facility. And then when we look to this year's operating budget, we want to see that continued commitment. And where you'll see that are in the line items for staff retention, staff education, and overall nutrition services, education services, all of those things. And within the DYS requested budget, as well as the original or this first drop of the version of the operating budget, that is what we see. So by 2027, admin costs will be raised to around $18 million in this proposition, $1 million for vocational services, which are staff trainings, 4.3 in education services, 4.3 million in education services. And so we are seeing that sort of commitment to this smaller is better model. And then in some respects, the proposed budget is actually seeing more money than what DYS originally asked for in the fall. And we see that mainly in diversion services through DYS's reclaim budget. And reclaim is the process by which DYS allocates money to communities and counties around the state to help divert youth and rehabilitate youth closer to home. And in this original proposition for the budget, in the governor's version, he proposed offering even more than what DYS was originally asking for. And so, as people have said, it is a long process. We have a long way to go with whatever version of the budget we end up getting. But in these early stages, it does look like this commitment to a more a better servicing youth services and a more evidence-based model for rehabilitative care is what's coming. So yeah, that is DYS and youth justice.
Thank you so much, Pat. So that is an uplifting update where we know smaller is better, and it seems like leadership from the top in the governor's office supports that and is hoping that we as a state can put our money where our mouth is. So we will definitely be engaged on this issue and watching as the process unfolds. So thank you again, Pat. We are now going to turn to our next issue. So if you remember, in November of 2023, voters overwhelmingly approved Issue 2, which legalized adult use cannabis across Ohio. This law also included several provisions related to an excise tax and also prescribed how that tax should be divvied up and distributed across the state through municipalities, different divisions, departments, etc. So I'm wondering, Patrick, if you could talk a little bit about the status quo of Issue 2 of cannabis law here in Ohio, and then what's happening currently in the Ohio General Assembly and how might that tie in to the budget?
For sure. So thanks, Jocelyn, for the handoff. Thanks, everyone, for sticking with us. No disrespect for the folks before me, but we saved the fun part for last, which is Ohio cannabis policy. So I'm going to cover a couple of things, but hoping to dovetail a few conversations that we've had tonight. One, tying in the budget, the entrance of policy when it comes down to the actual budget legislative process, and increased taxes as a little spoiler to what's ahead with cannabis policy navigating the State House. So like Jocelyn mentioned, back in November of 23, you all, Ohio voters, very resoundingly endorsed a few things that were contained in State Issue 2. which was a citizen-initiated statute, meaning a citizen-created law that was passed by ballot initiative. Garnering 57% of the vote, over 2 million votes, we saw resounding success for that issue. ACLU of Ohio supported issue 2, endorsed it for 2 primary reasons. The first, that it legalizes adult use cannabis and stems the tide of people into our jails and prisons for cannabis-related offenses. And second, because it begins to take an important second step after legalization, which is repairing the harm of the war on drugs. Which we think has been an abject failure. So that was not the end all be all to ending those harms, but what the issue did was create something called the Social Equity and Jobs Program, as well as make additional investments into the communities that have been harmed by the war on drugs, as well as communities that are providing host communities for dispensaries and other businesses in the cannabis world. So right now, we in Ohio enjoy a lot of those benefits of passing issue 2, along with the protections that came with them. But since the day that issue 2 passed, we've seen a number of attacks on the language in that bill, which in my opinion has been, really a general disregard for the will of Ohio voters. So first, and I think, most urgently to start with our legislative discussion, is Ohio Senate Bill 56. It's sponsored by Senator Steve Huffman. It is just Senator Steve Huffman as the sponsor at this time. But he is largely seen as the person quarterbacking, for lack of a better word, the cannabis policy from the Senate side. What Senate Bill 56 does is takes a multifaceted, axe to the issue 2 language that we all passed in November of 23. It does a few things. The first bucket I'll lump it into is a general disrespect or disregard for the will of voters. The second piece being a reduction in those protections for people who use cannabis, in addition to more criminalization of cannabis use. So that first piece, general rollback of the will of voters, we see a rollback of the maximum number of plants that a person can grow at home under that language, from 12 plants in a 2-adult household to 6 plants in a 2-adult household. We also see reduction in the max THC potency limits for things like cannabis extracts and flower. We also see under Senate Bill 56 an increase in tax dollars. So this is a feature of Senate Bill 56 and the budget discussion, but we see an increase from the 10% excise tax on cannabis sales in Ohio to 15%. All of this, as you might imagine, would mean a great amount of money flowing into our state because of cannabis sales. Just recently, after 6 months of sales, the state announced that I think we are over $319 million in adult use cannabis sales in Ohio. So really remarkable amount of money, especially when we think about that excise tax, 10% of that, and then, a portion of that going to the Social Equity and Jobs Program, which I hinted at before. Under issue 2's language, Social Equity and Jobs Program receives a very significant portion of that excise tax. By my back of the napkin math, that should have over $11 million already earmarked for the Social Equity and Jobs Program. But our politicians in Columbus want something to do with it. And what Senate Bill 56 proposes is a total evisceration of that language, elimination of the Social Equity and Jobs Program, elimination of the host community fund, elimination of a fund for mental health and addiction services, and a rerouting of that money into the state's general revenue fund. We've already seen some signals from the legislature that they intend to spend that money rather than on repairing the harms of the failed war on drugs on things like jails, prisons, policing, and the very same problems that we've been hoping to address after acknowledging that the war on drugs was not a success. So when might that be happening? You might be wondering to yourself at 6:53 on a Thursday night. The answer is very soon, potentially. We've been hearing on Cap Square, lawmakers intend to move this legislation out of the Ohio Senate before the end of February, which is just over 2 weeks from now. And so, if there's anything you take from my portion of tonight, please check out our website. There's action alerts on there, overviews of what's happening with the cannabis laws, and I'm sure we can drop some links in the chat about that for you to check out as well. But as you'll remember, Colin hinted earlier about how policy and legislation can work its way into our state budget process. And so we're seeing that happen in real time. Senate Bill 56 is not yet included as a part of the budget, It's still progressing along its legislative pathway in the Ohio General Assembly. However, we also see some signals from Governor DeWine's budget that he too is interested in changing the way our cannabis system, and especially where our tax dollars go from adult use cannabis in the state. Rather than the 50% increase from 10% excise tax to 15% that the Senate Bill 56 proposes, Governor DeWine proposes a 20% tax on top of cannabis sales. That's a pretty significant 100% increase in the tax rate. And the budget too proposes the elimination of those revenue streams into things like the Social Equity and Jobs Program, the Host Community Fund, and other places, and proposes a new path. And so some of those, I'd say at first glance are less problematic than others, but still a theme of, I think a general disregard for the will of voters, what they chose through their citizen-initiated statute process. And the governor instead diverts that money into things like get jails, prisons, policing, some less problematic initiatives. However, our running theme of all of this is voters chose this, they chose it resoundingly. And fun little spoiler as well, the legislature had a chance to make these amendments before it even appeared on the ballot in November of 2023. They chose not to do so, and now they want to have their cake and eat it too. So keep an eye out for action alerts from us. We'll be monitoring what goes in the budget, what happens in Senate Bill 56, and other legislation that we're expecting to impact cannabis policy as we move forward. So thanks again for sharing your time. I'm going to wrap up and happy to answer folks' questions.
Thank you so much, Patrick. So I think the short version of that is the legislature is mucking around with the will of the voters, and voters should be making their voices heard in opposition to that, and eyeing this law as it moves through the process, but also realizing this law could morph into something that becomes a budget amendment. Who knows? So with that, we have reached the end of our formal program with the topics that we wanted to share with you all. Just a quick plug that if you want to stay up to date on ACLU of Ohio issues, you can follow us on social media. We're on TikTok and X and Blue Sky and Instagram and Facebook and probably something else that I can't think of. Sign up for our emails, join our action teams. We'll be dropping links in the webinar chat for you all. So please join me in a round of applause for our panelists, even though our panelists can't hear or see it. Just know that we are all cheering you on for sharing your Thursday evening with us. We definitely have a little bit of flexibility and time for burning questions if anyone has those. So please, again, put any questions that you have in the Q&A function. And I am just going to start with a question that I have, which I think probably is on a lot of people's minds. There's been a lot of talk nationwide and here in Ohio on immigration. And there are federal pieces of legislation that have been introduced. There are bills that have been introduced at the state level. Many of them have to do with funding and whether or not you have a sanctuary city in your state or in your region. Additionally, here in Ohio, we have HB 26, I believe, which is the one that threatens to take away resources if you as a municipality don't comply with ICE and entering into agreements like 287G, which basically just means that your local law enforcement would be basically deputized to work with ICE. I'm curious if anyone on our panel has hot takes on the likelihood or even just ability of provisions like that related to immigration, and if people should be paying attention to that sort of thing creeping into our budget process.
Yeah, I can at least handle that one initially. So that everybody on the call knows, immigration law is federal law. The responsibility for enforcement of federal law is the federal government. But as Jocelyn alluded to, the federal government can partner with local governments, local law enforcement, the State Highway Patrol, for enforcement of certain limited aspects of immigration law. One of those is the 287G program that Jocelyn mentioned. But the overall message here, the takeaway is the level, the volume of deportations and enforcement that I think the Trump administration wants to engage in is not going to be possible with just ICE or the Department of Homeland Security. They really will require cooperation at the local level. And so when you look at something like the 287G program, you're talking about several dozen police departments, highway patrol, what have you, around the country that have joined that. None from Ohio currently. I think there's at least one pending application, but right now there's no Ohio law enforcement that is part of that. So that's really where a budget tie-in comes in as well. Would you be surprised to know that the training is inadequate, the funding is inadequate, et cetera, as far as the local governments go? That's a real problem right there. And so what we're looking at potentially is Ohio passing a bill that's going to require local law enforcement to cooperate with the federal government, not only in a formal 287G sense, but also each and every time that ICE comes knocking, wanting to enforce federal immigration law, this bill would force the local governments, the local law enforcement to go along. That, of course, is known in these worlds as an unfunded mandate, and that is exactly what this is. I don't know if the budget is looking or forecasting enough to say, hey, we think we're going to pass this bill, and so we want to properly fund law enforcement to do this. I doubt that they're thinking that far ahead, but this isn't something that's happening only in Ohio. This is a conversation that's happening around the country because, again, I think the Trump administration, somebody affiliated with the Trump administration, is out there saying, hey, look, states, we need you to get with the program. We need you to remove any barriers that might be out there, formal or informal, to local governments doing this. And we're going to essentially need you to force local governments to do this. But if they don't have proper funding to do it, that obviously there's a whole lot of reasons why this is a bad idea. But funding is certainly primary as far as the local governments are concerned. So what you're talking about is local governments, local law enforcement already complaining on an ongoing basis that they're not funded well enough already. And now you're adding much more to their plate. So that's something, again, get on the ACLU emails, the website, social media, everything. We've been covering this issue. We will continue to cover it. We will be actively opposing things like this. But if you are interested in the grand world of immigration enforcement and how that intersects with Ohio government and civil liberties, we will be there to keep you up to date.
Thank you so much, Gary. I also have just heard that we have some breaking news. Patrick, by chance, while we have been here in this program this evening, has something happened in the world of cannabis law?
Yes, and folks, we promise this is the truth, not made up for dramatic effect. Did just get the notice for committee hearings on Senate Bill 56 on Tuesday of next week. So please, if you have the time this weekend, check out the action alert on our website. You can do it tonight, do it this weekend. Let your lawmakers know, your thoughts on them rolling back the very things that you voted for just under a couple of years ago. So appreciate your support, and please tune in if you can.
Oh, goodness. Folks, we couldn't make this stuff up if we tried. This is how things happen here in Ohio. So please, we're lighting the fire for you all, pun intended here. Please take action on SB 56. Also, if you look at any of our cannabis related content, it is full of puns and enjoyable to read. Colin, there is a question in the chat related to federal funding and how much of that accounts for Ohio state budget. And folks were asking for a little clarity on that. Was it related to education or just generally in the budget?
So that 26% figure of federal funding, that is relative to the entire operating budget. So now a vast majority of Ohio's operating budget goes to education. So there is a very significant amount of federal funding that will go to our K through 12 schools, as well as our institutions of higher education. Funding streams including research grants, special education support, things of that nature. So that 26% figure does pertain to the entirety of the operating budget, but a significant portion of that is directed specifically to our K through 12 and higher education institutions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Colin. And again, I just want to take a moment to thank all of you for sharing your Thursday evening with us. We know many of you have other things to get to, so thanks for sharing the last hour. One last reminder to get social with us on social media, Twitter, Facebook, X, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok, you know, all the places. Sign up for our emails, our action alerts, so that you can engage on these issues with us very deeply. And we hope you all are heading into a wonderful evening. Thanks again.